My name is Edna Clark, and I've seen 82 years pass by since I first stepped foot in this house. It's an old house, perched on the edge of Silver Hollow, tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It's the kind of place where the fog rolls in at dawn, thick and white, like a blanket wrapped tight around the earth. I've spent my entire life here, in this place where the air smells of pine, and the soil is rich and heavy. People say the mountains keep you close, as if the land itself chooses who stays and who leaves. I suppose that's true in a way. The mountain doesn't let go easily, and neither did this house. Here comes a time when the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, just begs to be set free. So if you're watching, baby, go ahead and like this video, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's true life story. 'Cause this ain't just my story, it's the story of too many women who had to smile through the silence. They say the past never really leaves you. I think that's true too. Not all of it, anyway. The memories, some stay with you, tucked in the corners of your mind, like old knickknacks that you can't quite part with. Some of those memories are as bright and clear as the first morning light, while others are faded and worn, like the corners of an old quilt. This house has seen so many years, so many changes. It was once full of life, full of sound. The warmth of Mama's humming as she moved around the kitchen, her voice soft and steady like the flow of a river. The sound of Nathan's laughter, big and loud enough to fill every corner. The way he would stomp his boots on the porch, making it feel like a stampede of joy was marching through our small world. That was a lifetime ago, before the air in this house grew still, before the silence became as thick and suffocating as the fog outside. Mama and Nathan are gone now. A slick road, a curve they knew all too well, and just like that, they were taken. I was 14 when it happened. I was just a girl, the last child in a family that had been whole and bright. Now, it's just me and my father, and the house that used to echo with love is quiet in a way I can't describe. The kind of quiet that seeps into your bones and stays there, turning everything cold. After they were gone, my father looked at me and saw something different. He used to call me his ghost child. He'd say it with a smile, a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it stuck with me. The name became a shadow that followed me everywhere. It wasn't a joke anymore. It wasn't funny. It became the truth. My skin was pale, my hair white as if I was touched by something beyond this world. I don't know if that's what he saw when he looked at me, but I know that's what he said. I was the one left behind, the last piece of a world he didn't want to see anymore. I think he hated me for that. Hated that I was the one still breathing, still here in the house that used to hold everything he cared about. I was 14 when the grief took hold of him completely. It wrapped around his heart like the roots of an ancient tree and slowly turned him into a man I couldn't recognize. He stopped being the man who would laugh at my jokes and tell me I was the apple of his eye. Instead, he became a stranger in the same house we'd shared, a man who looked at me like I was an inconvenience. The silence between us grew. The house grew quieter. My footsteps on the wooden floors, the creak of the old house in the night, these were the sounds I came to know. But it wasn't just the house that had grown quiet, it was me too. I became small. I stopped speaking unless I had to. I learned how to move through the rooms without making a sound, hoping he wouldn't notice me, hoping the cold, invisible wall between us would keep me safe. But some things you can't outrun. You can't hide from them. No matter how small you make yourself, no matter how much you try to disappear, they'll find you. When I was 15, things got worse. My father, who had been nothing but distant after Mama and Nathan passed, grew colder. He didn't shout or cry. No, he didn't need to. His silence was enough to freeze the warmth in the house. I remember one night, when I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, though I can't remember the words anymore, just the feeling of the pages in my hands, the way the firelight flickered and danced around me. He walked into the room, his shadow looming over me. He stood there, just watching me, and I knew something was wrong. There was a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just the grief I'd seen. It was something darker, something deeper. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that cold, piercing look. And then, in the quiet of that night, he finally spoke. No decent boy from this town or any other is ever going to come calling for you. A pale, strange thing like you, he said, his voice low, flat. You belong here, Edna. You belong in this house. You're the family's shame, the ghost no one wants. And that means you belong to me. The words hit me like a blow to the stomach, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small. The air is too thick. The walls seemed to close in around me. That night, I realized something terrifying. My father wasn't just my father anymore. He was my jailer. He had locked me in a cage made of silence, of coldness, of his own grief. And I belonged to that cage now. I didn't know it at the time, but that moment marked the beginning of a new kind of life for me. The kind of life where the days bled into one another, where nothing changed except the seasons outside. I thought I knew what trouble was when I was a child, scraping my knee or getting in trouble for tracking mud on the floor. But now I know the real darkness that can creep into a life, the kind that doesn't make a sound. I spent years trapped in that silence, growing smaller and smaller, just hoping to disappear. But the house didn't let me go. The silence didn't let me go. And the story, my story, was just beginning. The days passed slowly in that house after my father's words. They dragged on, a thick blur of monotonous routine, like trying to walk through mud that never lets you lift your feet. The seasons outside changed, the trees bloomed and withered, the sun shifted across the sky, but inside the house, nothing moved. The clocks ticked, the wood creaked, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, but it all felt distant, as though the life outside couldn't quite reach us anymore. I had learned how to be still, how to walk with my shoulders hunched in, making myself smaller and smaller, as if I could just disappear into the shadows. My father's presence was always there, looming over me like a dark cloud. He didn't yell anymore. His anger was silent, like a storm waiting to break, but never quite doing so. He no longer needed to shout. His quiet was enough to make the house feel like it might collapse under its own weight. By the time I turned 16, I had learned the full meaning of silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something heavier, something suffocating. It was the weight of everything unsaid, of a lifetime of unspoken words and buried resentments, of love that had been twisted into something cruel and controlling. I spent most of my time in the garden, though it wasn't much of a garden. The soil was rocky, the plants sparse, but I made it my sanctuary. I would bury myself in the work, planting and weeding, just to fill the time, to keep my hands busy. I didn't mind the dirt under my fingernails or the sweat on my brow. It was something to do, something to keep me from thinking too much, from feeling too much. But no matter how deep I buried myself in the soil, I couldn't escape the cold silence that filled the house. It was during one of those long, empty afternoons that I realized something. I was becoming invisible. My father didn't speak to me unless he had to, and when he did, his words were harsh, like stones thrown in my direction. He treated me like a piece of furniture, something that belonged to the house, but didn't need to be acknowledged. He had broken me without raising a hand, and now he was erasing me, making sure I stayed in my place, kept out of sight. Sometimes, I would look out the window at the world beyond our fence, at the other children playing in the yard, laughing and shouting, and I would wonder what it would be like to be one of them. To be free. To have a life that wasn't dictated by fear and silence. But then I would turn my gaze back to the house and feel the weight of it all settle back into my chest. I was trapped here, in this house, with no way out. My father had made sure of that. One evening, when I was 17, I finally worked up the courage to speak. I had been holding it in for so long, the words bubbling up in my throat, desperate to be heard. But when I spoke, it wasn't a question, or a demand, or even a plea. It was a confession. A quiet admission that I was tired of being the ghost he had made me. "Father," I said, my voice soft and uncertain. "Do you even see me anymore?" He was sitting at the table, the same as always, a bottle of whiskey in front of him, his eyes distant. He didn't look up when I spoke. His gaze stayed fixed on the glass in his hand, swirling the amber liquid as if it could tell him everything he needed to know. "I see you," he muttered, his voice rough from the alcohol. "You're still here. That's all that matters." That was all he had left to say to me. That was all I had ever been to him, a reminder that his world had been broken, a ghost that refused to leave. I could feel the weight of his words settle over me, crushing any hope that had been left in my chest. I was nothing, and he would never see me for anything else. I stopped speaking after that. The silence between us grew thicker, and I became more and more a part of the house, as though I was becoming its walls, its beams, its floorboards. I had no name, no voice. I was the ghost child, the shame he had created, the one he kept locked away and out of sight. But there were moments, in the dead of night, when the house would creak and groan under the weight of its years, and I would wonder if maybe, just maybe, the silence wasn't just my prison. Maybe it was his too. Maybe the house had begun to haunt him as much as it haunted me. As the years passed, the seasons turned again and again. Spring came with its flowers and hope, but by the time I was 18, that hope had long withered away. There was no escape, no light beyond the walls of the house. I learned to accept it, the coldness, the emptiness. It was easier that way. But then, when I was 19, something changed. Something I couldn't control. It wasn't much at first, just a shift in the air. The heavy quiet of the house started to feel different. It was still there, that weight of unspoken words, but it wasn't quite the same. It was the same old house, the same old silence, but there was a flicker now. A tiny spark that couldn't be ignored. And just when I thought I might crumble beneath the weight of it all, that spark started to grow. It was a single red thread, tied around a small wrist. And I knew, somehow, it was mine to protect. I was 19 when the first child came, and in the stillness of that house, I thought for the briefest moment that perhaps life was starting again. The air outside was crisp, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air like ghosts of yesterday. I had gone to bed that night, as I always did, with my thoughts tangled in the quiet, knowing that nothing would ever change. But that night, as the hours crawled on and the house settled into its familiar groan, something stirred inside me. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker of discomfort, a tightness in my chest. The pain came quickly, sharp, unfamiliar. And I knew, deep down, that it was too late to turn back. I had been in this house for so long, buried under the weight of my own silence, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be alive in any way other than as a shadow. But this was real. The pain, the sensation of something shifting inside me, something growing. I lay there, trembling in the dark, unable to move. I had never felt such a thing before, never expected it. My body, once the prison of my father's neglect, was now the vessel of something entirely new. Hours passed before I could summon the courage to rise. I stumbled into the kitchen, the cold floor under my bare feet grounding me in a reality I had tried so hard to ignore. The old clock ticked away in the corner, each second stretching into eternity. And then I heard it, the faintest knock at the door. A sound so small, so delicate, that it might have been my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew it wasn't. I opened the door, and there they were, Pastor Allen and Martha Miller. Martha had been a constant presence in my life, always hovering at the edges of my world, a quiet, sad figure. She was always there at church potlucks, at social gatherings, her eyes soft and distant, as if she were studying the world from behind a thick fog. She never spoke much, but when she did, her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves, faint, barely audible. That night, her face was different. Her eyes were harder, more focused, and her hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the house. She didn't look at me, she never did, but I felt her presence, like a shadow passing through the room. Pastor Allen spoke first, his voice smooth and unbothered by the weight of the moment. "Edna, we're here for you, child," he said. His words felt like a prayer, but the hollow piety behind them left a bitter taste in my mouth. "Martha will help. You just relax now. This is what we do." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. It was as though my body had forgotten how to function. I didn't know what to expect, didn't know what was going to happen, but in that moment, all I could feel was the pain. The suffocating, overwhelming pain. Martha stepped forward, her hands gliding over the fabric of her dress as if it were made of something softer than the air between us. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. Her hands, so gentle, moved to my side, urging me to lie down. I obeyed, the world spinning around me as she took control. I lay there, unable to do anything, as Martha worked in silence, her fingers trembling with the weight of something I couldn't understand. I remember the coldness of her hands as they touched me, the scent of lilac clinging to her skin like the last memory of a time before everything had fallen apart. It was familiar, but not in the way it should have been. It felt like a ritual, one I had never been a part of but was forced to witness. The baby came in the early hours of the morning, but there was no joy in the air, no cries of life. There was only the soft rustle of Martha's dress, the quiet murmurs of Pastor Allen as he stood in the corner, his shadow stretched long across the floor. And then, as Martha cradled the child, the weight of the world seemed to fall back into place, the silence in the room growing heavier by the second. I watched as she wrapped the baby in the blanket she had brought, her hands shaking just slightly, though she tried to hide it. She didn't look at me as she left, but before she disappeared through the door, she paused. Her hand brushed against the baby's wrist, and there it was, a tiny red thread tied around the baby's wrist. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. But the act, the small, deliberate touch, felt like a bridge between us, a silent understanding passed between us in that moment. She wasn't just taking my baby away. She was taking a piece of me with her. And, in some strange, twisted way, she knew what that felt like. Martha had become my only witness, the only person who saw me, really saw me, in all my grief and desperation. She wasn't an accomplice in the way Pastor Allen was. No, she was something else, someone trapped in the same cage, someone whose own sorrow mirrored mine. But after that first loss, something inside me began to change. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment when I started to rebel. The first knot of resistance, so tiny, so faint, was tied in my heart, a whisper I couldn't ignore. My body was still my father's, but my soul had started to fight. After that night, the visits became a regular thing. Each time Martha came, taking a little piece of me with her, a child to place in some other home, to be raised by strangers who would never know the story that had led them to her doorstep. Each time, I tied another thread, a tiny red string of rebellion, a mark of my motherhood, a claim to the children I had never been able to keep. But with each visit, I began to feel it, something shifting inside me. It was small at first, the faintest flicker, but it was there. The tiny acts of defiance, threads tied to wrists, secret messages passed between Martha and me, were the only thing that kept me going. They were the only thing that made me feel like I still had a part in the world outside the house, a part in something bigger than the silence that had defined my life for so long. I was 19 and I had already lost so much. But I was starting to understand that sometimes, the things we lose are the things that give us the strength to fight back. The cycle began again, the endless repetition of quiet pain and inevitable loss. With each child that came, I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, my father's cruelty would ease. Maybe this time, I would be able to keep one, just one, of my children. But the hope was always fleeting, slipping through my fingers like the last rays of a setting sun. I turned 20, then 21, then 22. The seasons changed, but my world remained as cold and still as the first winter after Mama and Nathan were taken from me. Each new birth brought its own turmoil. Each time I felt the life growing inside me, I thought maybe this child would be the one to break the cycle, the one to change everything. But each time, I tied another thread, watched as Martha came and took my children away, and with them, a piece of my soul. I began to learn to live with the pain, to expect it, to accept it, even. The house became quieter still. There was no longer any pretense of love between me and my father. He didn't look at me anymore. He didn't speak to me unless it was to give a cold, sharp order. I did the chores, I cooked his meals, I washed his clothes, all in silence. I had become as much a part of the furniture as the walls and the floorboards, invisible, unimportant. But the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and it seeped into every corner of my being. I had stopped dreaming of escape. I had stopped imagining a life beyond the house. There was no hope left in me, only a quiet, unrelenting sorrow that I had learned to wear like a shroud. At night, I would sit by the window and watch the stars flicker in the sky, feeling the ache in my heart deepen with each passing year. Sometimes, I would hear the soft sound of a dog barking in the distance, or the rustle of leaves in the wind, and for a moment, I would think that maybe the world outside hadn't forgotten me. Maybe there was something out there, beyond the walls of this house, that could still offer me a glimmer of light. But then I would turn back to the house, to my father sitting in his chair, to the shadows in the corners of the room, and I would remember that the outside world was no longer mine to claim. I had lost it all. The house, the land, my family, everything was gone, swallowed up by the weight of silence. It wasn't until I was 23 that I felt the first stirrings of rebellion again. It wasn't much, just a whisper in the back of my mind, a feeling that there was something I needed to do, something I had to try. I had grown accustomed to the idea that my life was a series of losses, but this time, something inside me flared up, just a flicker of defiance, a desire to break free. I knew I couldn't leave the house. My father had seen to that. But I could still make a small mark on the world. I could still find a way to let my children know they had not been forgotten, that they had not been taken from me willingly. And so, I began to tie the threads. It became my ritual, my act of rebellion. Each thread was a mark of my love, a secret message that only they and I would ever know. Red for the first, blue for the second, green for the third. Each color had its meaning, its message, its prayer. And each time, as Martha came and took my children, I whispered a promise to them: "You are mine. I will never forget you." It was all I could give them. It was all I could do. But as the years went on, the threads became more than just symbols of my motherhood. They became my lifeline. Every time I tied a thread, every time I saw Martha's gentle, trembling hands hold my babies, I felt like I was reaching out to something outside this prison. I was sending them a message that they were loved, that they were wanted, even if they could never stay with me. And yet, the more I tied the threads, the more I felt the weight of my own failure. I had failed to protect them. I had failed to keep them safe. I had failed as a mother, as a woman, as a person who still had a chance at a life of her own. I didn't know if I could go on living like this, tied to a house, tied to a man whose silence cut through me like a knife. But the threads kept me going. They were the only thing that reminded me that I was still here, still breathing, still a mother, no matter how much I had been stripped of. And I clung to them, even as the house grew quieter, even as the years stretched on like a long, endless road. One night, when I was 24, something happened that shook me to my core. It wasn't a loud thing. It wasn't anything anyone could hear. Not unless they were looking for it. But it was enough to change everything. I was sitting by the fire, sewing a patch into one of my father's old shirts. It was quiet, too quiet, and I could feel the walls pressing in around me. That's when I heard it, a whisper, faint and soft, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't my father's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was a sound I hadn't heard in so long: laughter. Soft, innocent laughter, like the kind Nathan used to make when he was a boy. The kind that filled the house with warmth and joy. I got up slowly, my legs stiff from sitting so long. I walked to the window and looked out into the night, expecting to see nothing. But instead, I saw it, movement. Not from the trees or the wind, but from the porch. There, in the dim light of the porch lamp, stood a figure. A small figure. It wasn't my father. It wasn't anyone I knew. But there was something about it, something familiar, something that made my heart twist in my chest. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't say for sure what it was, but at that moment, I knew the ghosts were watching me. They weren't just memories. They were alive, in a way. And they were waiting for me to finally break free. It was late one evening, the house draped in the stillness of another long day. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting soft shadows across the walls. My father was asleep in his chair in the parlor, his snores filling the space with a sound that might have once been comforting, but now felt like the droning of an old machine. I was alone, the weight of the years pressing on my shoulders, but for the first time in so long, I felt something stir inside me, a small, flickering spark, a feeling that something was about to change. It had been nearly 10 years since that first loss. 10 years of silent rebellion in the form of red threads, of longing glances out the window at the world that felt so far away. 10 years of quietly watching as the seasons passed and as my life seemed to fade into the backdrop of that house. I had grown accustomed to the silence, to the constant ache of loss, but something I couldn't name began to shift. The knock on the door that night didn't come from Martha. It wasn't the usual soft, gentle rattle of her knuckles on the door frame. This was a knock I hadn't heard in years, a knock that didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was firm, urgent, like a heartbeat echoing through the quiet house. My pulse quickened, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I rose from my seat by the fire, my legs stiff and uncertain, and walked to the door. The air around me felt electric, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. When I opened the door, I was met by a figure I didn't recognize, a man, older than me, with a weary expression, but a spark in his eyes that reminded me of something I had long since forgotten. "Edna Clark?" he asked, his voice steady but full of something I couldn't place. "Yes," I replied, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. He stepped into the light, and I saw the badge pinned to his coat, a sheriff's badge. The shock hit me like a wave. I didn't know why he was here, why the sheriff of this small, forgotten town would come to my doorstep after all these years. I had no reason to expect anything from the outside world, and yet here he was. "Ma'am," he said, his tone softer now, "I'm Sheriff James Harrow. I'm here about your father. There's been a situation, and I need to speak with you about it." I felt the blood drain from my face. My father? What could have happened to him? Had he gotten into trouble again? I couldn't imagine what kind of situation would bring a sheriff to my door after all this time. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. "Please, come in," I said, my voice trembling. I didn't know why, but something about the way he stood in the doorway, like he was waiting for me to invite him in, to open up the door to whatever came next, made me feel as though something was finally moving. As though something had begun to shift, beyond my control. Sheriff Harrow entered the house slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He looked around the room with the same kind of curiosity I had seen in the eyes of strangers passing through town, wondering about the reclusive woman who lived in the house on the hill. "You're alone, then," he said, not really a question but a statement. It wasn't surprising to him, I suppose. People in Silver Hollow had always been curious about me, about the ghost child who never seemed to age, the woman who kept to herself and never spoke to anyone. But now, in this moment, with this sheriff standing in my living room, I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I didn't feel invisible. I felt alive. "Yes," I answered, my voice quieter than usual. "My father is in the other room." "What has happened?" The sheriff hesitated for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. He looked toward the parlor door, where my father slept, the alcohol still heavy in his breath. And then, with a finality I hadn't expected, he spoke. "Your father's gone, Edna. We found him out back. He passed away sometime today." The words hit me like a physical blow, a shockwave that rocked my very core. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. I hadn't imagined my father's death would come from a place so distant, so ordinary. He had been a constant presence, even in his absence, his coldness, his silence, the way he'd looked through me every day for years. But now there would be no more of it. There would be no more watching me, no more silently erasing me from the world. My father was gone, and with his death came the end of a chapter one had thought would never close. For a long time, I didn't speak. The room around me seemed to grow smaller and smaller, the air thinner, until I could barely breathe. I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me, the years spent as a ghost, as an invisible thing, trapped in the walls of this house. I felt all the years of silence crash over me at once, a tidal wave of grief and release. "I'll take care of it," the sheriff said, his voice calm but firm. "But you need to know, it wasn't just a death. There were other things we're still piecing together. We're gonna need to look into everything." I nodded numbly, unable to form words. I wasn't sure what he meant. I wasn't sure what any of it meant. All I knew was that the silence, the haunting, the presence of my father in the house, it was over. For better or for worse, it was finished. As the sheriff walked away, I stood in the doorway, my mind racing. I couldn't quite grasp what had just happened, what this meant for me, for my life. My father had been my jailer, my tormentor, my reason for everything that had happened in this house. But now, with him gone, it was like the shackles had been released. The walls of this house were no longer holding me in place. I was free. But freedom felt strange. It felt like an unfamiliar world. I had spent so long inside these walls, so long in silence, that I didn't know how to step out. I didn't know how to breathe without the weight of his presence bearing down on me. I looked over at the parlor door, at the empty chair where my father used to sit. I realized then that the world was open to me now, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. The past, my father, the house, the silence, was all still with me. It would always be with me. But now there was space. There was room for something new. The next few days passed in a blur. The sheriff took care of the necessary arrangements, and the town came in droves to pay their respects. Some were curious, others out of duty, but none of them really knew. None of them knew the man my father had been, or the man I had lived with for so long. They saw a man who had passed, a soul lost to age and sorrow. But they didn't see the chains he had placed around me, or the way he had kept me buried, locked away from the world. I found myself standing by the window again, watching the world go by. The breeze stirred the leaves outside, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The ghosts were still here, there was no denying that, but they weren't haunting me anymore. They were just with me. And I was beginning to understand that maybe it wasn't about getting rid of them. It was about learning to live with them. The days after my father's death felt like I was waking up from a long, endless sleep. The fog that had covered my life for so long began to lift, but even as the weight of my father's presence faded, a new weight settled over me. Freedom, I realized, is not something you are simply given. It is something you must learn to navigate, a world you must figure out how to walk in after a lifetime of being bound by invisible chains. For the first time in a long while, I found myself alone in the house, without the suffocating presence of my father. The silence was different now. It was quieter, yes, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of years past. Now, it was more like the silence you find in an empty room when all the noise has finally stopped. It was the kind of silence you have when you're left with only yourself. But even that silence, that space, felt too wide. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether I should jump or turn back. I knew that my father's death had changed everything. I was no longer bound by his rule, no longer shackled by his cruelty. But I also knew that, in some way, I was still bound by the past. The ghosts of my lost children, the years spent as a prisoner in my own home, the years of silence, they would always be a part of me. Still, for the first time, I felt a strange pull to move forward. I couldn't explain it, but it was there. A small, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, I could begin again. I had buried myself in silence for so long that the thought of breaking it felt like an impossible task. But if my father's death had taught me anything, it was that silence could be broken. That freedom was something that could be found, even in the darkest of places. It started with a letter. It had been a year since my father died, and the house was still the same, silent, empty, but with the faintest hum of something changing. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I found an old envelope in the drawer of the kitchen table. It was yellowed, aged with time, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar to me. There was no return address, only a name. Henderson. The word hit me like a lightning bolt. Henderson. It was the name I had clung to for so many years, The name from the note Martha had given me all those years ago. Henderson Valley. A place, a lifeline, something I had never dared to chase. But now, that name was staring back at me from the letter, and suddenly, I knew that the time had come. I opened the letter with trembling hands. The paper was old and brittle, but the words inside were clear, written in a neat, precise script. It was a short letter, only a few lines long, but it made my heart race with excitement and dread. Dear Edna Clark, I am writing to inform you that we have located the records of your children. They were placed with adoptive families many years ago, and we have found their names. I understand this news may be difficult to hear, but I believe it is time for you to know the truth. If you wish to learn more, please contact me at the address below. I can help you reconnect with them. Yours faithfully, Lydia Green, Adoption Specialist. The letter seemed to hang in the air for a long time before the words truly sank in. I could feel the weight of the years of waiting and wondering crash over me. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment that could break the silence and allow me to finally reach out to the children I had lost so long ago. But the fear was just as strong as the hope. What if they didn't want to meet me? What if they had moved on, lived lives that had nothing to do with me? What if I had waited too long, held on to the past for too long, and now it was too late? I sat there in the quiet of the house, holding the letter in my hands, the fire flickering in the hearth. I realized, for the first time, that it wasn't just the past I was afraid of. It was the unknown future. The fear of facing them, of stepping out into a world that I had kept at arm's length for so long. But then I thought of the red threads I had tied around their wrists, of the promise I had made to them, even if they never knew it. I am your mother, I had whispered to them, over and over, with each child I lost. You are mine. I will never forget you. The words from the letter echoed in my mind. I have found their names. I knew that, for the first time in years, I had a chance to change my story, to reclaim what I had lost. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was a mother who had lived through darkness and silence, and now I had the chance to bring my children back into the light. The next morning, I went into town. It had been a long time since I had stepped outside the house with any real purpose. But now I had a purpose, and I felt the weight of it pressing on me like a heavy cloak. I walked into the small post office and handed the letter to the clerk. My hands were shaking as she took it, her eyes glancing over the envelope before she nodded. I'll send it off for you, Miss Clark, she said, her voice kind but distant, as though she were speaking to a stranger. As I walked back home, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was the right thing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just waiting for someone to open the door. I was opening it myself. The days that followed were filled with a nervous energy that I couldn't shake. I spent my time working in the garden, cleaning the house, anything to keep my mind occupied. But every time the wind blew through the trees or the mailman arrived, my heart would leap into my throat. And then, one afternoon, it came. Another letter. The handwriting was familiar this time. Dear Edna, I received your letter and I can hardly express the emotions I felt reading it. I had no idea you were out there, waiting for me. For us. We have been looking for you for so long, and I never imagined you would be looking for us too. I am Sarah Henderson. You are my mother, and I have missed you my entire life. I dropped the letter onto the table, my hands trembling as tears filled my eyes. The floodgates that I had kept sealed for so long burst open, and I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. Sarah was alive. She was real, and she wanted to find me. The letter went on to tell me about her life, about her brother and sister, and how they had found each other through DNA testing. They were a family now, a family that was waiting for me. I was no longer a ghost. I was a mother who had been found. I was a woman who had lived through silence and pain, and now I had the chance to build a new life. A life that had been waiting for me, just as I had been waiting for it. The week after receiving Sarah's letter, I barely slept. Each night I lay awake, my thoughts swirling like the autumn leaves that drifted past my window. 1,000 questions raced through my mind, each one tumbling over the other, faster than I could catch them. What would they be like? What would I say when I finally met them? After all these years, all this silence, how would we bridge the gap between the mother I had been in my mind and the stranger I was in their lives? But there was one thing that became clear in the stillness of those sleepless nights. I couldn't wait any longer. I had spent so many years frozen in a world of ghosts, tied to memories and threads. It was time to step out of the shadows. Time to meet the children I had lost, the children I had dreamed of every single day. I spent the next few days in a haze of nervous energy, unable to focus on anything. I tried to prepare the house, to make it presentable, but nothing seemed right. How do you prepare for something so life-changing, something so monumental? I had spent decades living in a world of silence, hiding from everything. How do you step into the light after so long in the dark? When the day finally came, it was an ordinary one, the kind that slips by unnoticed in the routine of daily life. The sun was bright, the air crisp and clear, but there was electricity in the air, a hum beneath the surface of everything. My heart was racing as I stood by the window, watching the world pass by. The thought of stepping outside, of walking into the unknown, made my stomach twist with nerves. But I couldn't turn back. I had come too far. Anna, the young librarian who had helped me with the letters, offered to drive me to the small town where Sarah now lived. She was kind, her quiet presence reassuring in a way I had never known. She didn't ask questions. She just offered her help, understanding that this was something I had to do, something I had to face on my own. I wore a simple blue dress, the color of the morning sky, a choice that felt meaningful in a way I couldn't explain. It was a dress I had bought years ago, back when I still had hope, before my life had been swallowed by the silence of the house. But today, it felt like a piece of the woman I had once been, a woman who had dreams, who had been alive before the weight of grief and fear pressed down on her every day. As we drove through the winding roads, the landscape outside the car window seemed unfamiliar to me. The world felt new, almost too bright, as though I were seeing it for the first time. I had been so used to the narrow, confining view of my house, the walls that had kept me safe, but at the same time, had kept me locked away from everything that mattered. Now, as I looked out at the open road, I felt the first stirrings of freedom. When we arrived at the cafe where Sarah had agreed to meet me, my heart pounded in my chest. I had no idea what to expect. But when I stepped inside, I saw them immediately. 3 people, sitting at a table near the window, their faces tense with nervous excitement. At first glance, they were strangers. They didn't look like me, not in the way I had imagined they would. But when I saw Sarah, my heart skipped a beat. She had my eyes. The same dark eyes that my mother had passed down to me. They were wide and searching, filled with so many questions, and yet so much warmth. She had a strength about her that I couldn't ignore, a quiet assurance that she had lived a life filled with love, even if it hadn't been mine to give. And then, there was David, her brother. He had the same strong jawline as my father, but his smile was warm, welcoming. He stood as I approached, and his hand stretched out to mine. His touch was gentle, and I felt something stir inside me, a connection that went beyond blood. The third, Mary, was the one who looked most like me. There was something about her, something in the way she held herself, that felt familiar. A flicker of recognition flashed between us, and when our eyes met, I could see it. She had been looking for me, just like I had been looking for her. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, constricted by a lifetime of silence. But they didn't need me to speak. They were waiting, just as I was, to see what would happen next. We sat down, and for the first few minutes it was awkward. We fumbled for words, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to begin. It felt like we were strangers trying to fit pieces of a puzzle together. But slowly, as we shared our stories, our lives, our struggles, our joys, the awkwardness began to fade. We were not strangers. We were family. The first thing Sarah said to me was something I never expected. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I've waited my whole life for this moment. I've missed you, Mama." The words hit me like a tidal wave. Mama. She called me Mama. The word felt foreign to my ears, but it was also the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The word I had waited to hear for so long, the word that I had buried deep inside me, was finally spoken aloud. We spent the next few hours talking, laughing, and crying. Slowly, the years between us began to fade away, and the bond we had shared, no matter how many years had passed, came rushing back. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many things I wanted to ask, but for now I didn't need to. We were together. That was enough. As we were about to part, Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet-covered box. It was delicate, simple, and when she opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Inside, nestled on a bed of white cotton, was a small piece of red thread. I looked at her, confused for a moment, and she smiled. "My mother," Sarah said, her voice soft, "found this tied around my wrist the day I was brought home. She didn't know what it meant, but she kept it all these years. On my 18th birthday, she gave it to me. She said it was from you." I couldn't breathe. The red thread. The very symbol of my rebellion, my love, my motherhood. It had survived, passed through the hands of a stranger who had taken my child and kept it safe for me. For all these years, Martha had kept it, just as I had kept my secret. And now it has come full circle. I reached out and took the thread, my fingers trembling as I held it. The same red thread that I had tied around my children's wrists, the same thread that had been my only act of motherhood, had made it back to me. It was a small piece of my soul, now returned. The ghosts of my past, my mother, my father, my lost children, were no longer haunting me. They were with me, yes, but they were at peace. And now I have a future to look forward to. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was messy, complicated, and still full of unanswered questions. But it was a beginning. A new chapter in a life that had been buried under silence for too long. A life I had fought to get back, a life I was ready to live. This is where my story begins. If this story reached you in any way, please like this video and share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of survival, strength, and grace. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because when we speak, even in whispers, the world begins to listen. God bless you. And thank you for listening to mine.